So thank you very much. Yeah, thank you for your help. Well, in this communication, I will examine Wasuregatami, which translates to the memento, which is Wakamatsu Shizuko's Japanese translation of Adelaide and Proctor's poem Sailor Boy, which goes back to the second half of the 19th century. First, since we don't have many time, I will just skip through the table of contents that I'm going to talk about today. First, let me briefly present or introduce who Wakamatsu Shizuko was, since this is a panel about under-researched translators or people. I thought that talking about Wakamatsu Shizuko was interesting because it's somewhat famous in the world of Japanese translation in Japan, but maybe not so much beyond that. So Wakamatsu Shizuko was a Japanese author, a translator, and essayist who lived in the second half of the 19th century in Japan. She was also a divulgator of children's literature, and she also contributed to the literary movement called Genbun Ichi, or Writers to Speak literary style. She received a Western style education, so this is why she was so proficient in English. She translated authors such as Charles Dickens, Irene Proctor, Frances Hodgson Burnett, and so on and so on. And since she was so proficient with her English, she also did some inverse translations of Japanese classics into English. So in today's presentation, we will examine Wasuregatami, this translation of the Sailor Boy, which she called the memento, which is Wasuregatami in Japanese. This story talks about a young boy who lives with his old caretaker Walter in somewhere in England, and they live next to a castle in the country where there is a lord and a lady. And this lord and lady come to this area once in a year. And this young boy, this young boy who is the protagonist is also always very happy to see the lady, the countess of the area, and to be with her and play with her. However, although this little boy is unaware of it, the countess, the lady, is in fact his real birth mother, who gave him away after she became a young widow, and the lord of the area insisted that she marry him. And in the story, everyone seems to know that, or be aware that that's the parentage, but the young boy is not aware of that. So in the previous presentation, other presenters talk about children's literature. This presentation connects to that a little bit too. This story could be categorized as children's literature, even though at first it may look like it. This is because it could be considered like an ambivalent text, like it is the case with Alice in Wonderland, since it allows for more literal, adventurous reading by the young reader, but it also invites from more sophisticated reading by the adult reader with this coming-of-age story, just beyond the adventures of the young boy. In this presentation, I will use as a theoretical framework Eben Zohar's polysystem theory, and I will also use how this is applied into children's literature. According to Eben Zohar's polysystem theory, it is defined as a multiple system, a system of various systems that intersect with each other. Literature, according to him, should not be examined independently, but in relation to social, cultural, economic, historical, and literary powers. And the relationship between these systems take place in this special hierarchy. Some academics, like Zohar Shavit, who was mentioned before in a previous talk, stress the importance of this system when talking about children's literature, because according to her, children's literature should be a subsystem of the literary system, and consequently, translated children's literature should be a subsystem of children's literature. I'm also going to use a little bit the concepts of domestication and foreignization. I'm sure most of you are familiar with them. They are rooted in Friedrich Schleiermacher's notions, and they were then popularized by Venuti. However, in this presentation, I will use Venuti's term in the sense that he envisioned it at the beginning. Benuti mentioned that foreignizing is not a translation that is stylistically close to the foreign text, but rather it's a translation that is written in a defamiliarizing language, or a translation that goes beyond literalism to advocate for experimentalism, which he calls innovative translating. And this can be seen sometimes in how the dialects are employed or how the registers and styles in the translations are used. So I'm going to use this foreignizing term in the sense of defamiliarizing, as Benuti envisioned in his 2000 book and later readings. So for the methodology, I examined both the translated text and the paratext of Wasurigatami, and since we don't have much time, I will focus very briefly on the paratext, and I will go to the analysis of the text. It's a qualitative analysis, and I compared the source text, which is written in in English, and the target text, which is written in Japanese. Let us take a brief look first at the paratext of Wasurigatami. First and foremost, in this translation, since it is rather short, Wakamatsu Shizuko, the translator, did not use footnotes. She does in other translations, but not in this one. However, it is very interesting what she wrote in her preface, which you can find in the right side of your screen. In this fragment, she first quotes some sentences from the original poem in English from the Sailor Boy. In where she says, how kind, how fair she was, how good, I cannot tell you if I could, you would love her. It is a fragment where the sailor boy talks about the countess. Again, by using this quote in her translation, it shows how Wakamatsu Shizuko tried to, let us say, important the relation between this young boy and the mother, who is actually her secret mother. And she wanted to stress that in her preface. She also wanted to stress some other important topics that were very important for her, such as the figure or the position of a child or childhood in Meiji Japan. And also she wanted to stress the importance of love between mother and son. She also wanted to inculcate some morals in translation, and that's for another topic to discuss entirely. And we can see how her morals have been influenced in the way she picked this precise phrase. It's also interesting to say that in Japanese, I quoted Japanese sentences here, she's saying that she's clearly stating that her text is a translation. So to make her readers aware that this is not an original Japanese text, but a translation from an English poem. And it is rather interesting that she mentions that the original, that she tried to frame this as a story, as a monogatari buri. She tried to make this poem into a story, but she says in Japanese, moto yori shosetsu nado to iu beki de mono wa arimasen. She says that originally this original text should maybe not be called a novel, which is rather interesting, maybe because it was not very long. So this is the preface that she writes. Let us take a look at how she translated this. Well, first and foremost, her translation is an adaptation, we could say, a hon-an in Japanese. Shizuko was able to adapt the source text with rather accurate translation. However, she nevertheless did some adaptations of cultural references, for instance. However, it should be noted that hon-an or adaptation was rather common in Meiji Japan at the second half of the 19th century, and it did not have the same negative connotations that it may have or had in other literary systems. And in this case, then, at first glance, this text seems like it's using a domesticating approach, understood here as a fluent translation that does not register the linguistic and cultural difference by reducing the foreignness of the source text to cultural values of the target language. So let us take a look at how Shizuko translated this story, mostly focusing on the domesticating traits of the text. Due to time constraints, I will not talk about all these examples, but if you take a look at table 1, it can be seen how Shizuko localizes the names of the characters and some toponyms into traditional Japanese names. For instance, the old Walter, here referred to as kinsman, becomes Tokuzo Oji, which translates to Uncle Tokuzo. The countess or the lady becomes Okusama, which literally translates to the wife, which is the traditional way in which ladies or wives of important men are called in Japanese. And so actually, the narrator also talks about a place in the English countryside, but this in Japanese is changed into the Ashikaga period time, and the little boy talks about a time in which some events took place in Japanese society called the Go-Isshin, which is an old way of calling the Meiji Isshin or the Meiji Restoration. So Shizuku adapts all these time-related elements into the Japanese context, and also she translates, localizes, adapts the English names into the Japanese equivalents. So this would look like a rather domesticating translation. Also, in the process of rewriting her poem into a narrativized text, Shizuko does not hesitate to include remarks that do not appear in the source text. She actually walks a fine line between adaptation and creative writing. This is the case when, for instance, in translation, she adds the sentence which refers to Tametomo. Minamoto no Tametomo was a samurai warrior, we could say, who was very well known in the Italian language for his prowess in the seas. And Shizuko includes this target text reference, maybe to include more familiar references to the target readership. But this, of course, is it could also be created as considered as creative writing. Not only cultural references are incorporated, Shizuko also adds full sentences like the one that you have here. Boku wa mada chisakatta keredo, jibun no koto wa yoku oboete masu yo. I was still very young then, but I remember it quite well. In here, then, Shizuko, by adding, including this sentence, she is reminding her readers that the following story is, in fact, recounted by the young boy as a flashback. So there are some additions through the story that are constant, but most of them are included in a way that the rhythm is not only kept, but enhanced. They add information for the reader, whether that's good or bad. There are also some omissions in the text, mostly words or sentences that refer to the original source culture landscape, such as references to dragons or some descriptions of, for instance, the countess who has golden hair or blue eyes. All these things are completely omitted. They disappear from the translation, probably because Shizuko considered that Japanese characters were not supposed to have these physical traits. However, Shizuko also took into account readability and semiotic factors when choosing the more adequate style for her translation. For Shizuko, like I mentioned before, translation was a means to an end. That is, she wanted to inculcate morals to her mostly feminine readership. She wanted her text to have a moralizing purpose for her readership, to increase the awareness towards childhood, for instance. And for that, she needed to render Proctor's words in a style that could be clearly understood to her readers, which also felt natural to her. You must be aware that most women writers at that time used a rather classical Japanese style, but Shizuko was not very familiar with it because of her Western style education. Then she decided to render this story in the colloquial Genbun Ichi, or write as you speak literary style. This was popularized by Japanese author Wakabayashi some years ago, although it was not dominant yet in Shizuko's times, even though it would end up becoming mostly dominant, and it would be the basis of modern Japanese language. However, in Shizuko's time, this rather vernacular style was not seen very appropriate to women writers and some translators. The fact that Shizuko used it on translation, which traditionally was considered not as important as writing fiction, might have given Shizuko some leniency to avoid criticism by the literary establishment. We could also say that another form of defamiliarization could be seen in the adaptation of the original poem into the Japanese monogatari style, very well known in target culture. The monogatari style would translate as the narrative style. It's not a poem, it has been turned into a narration. And also served as facilitate being read aloud to children, since orality is one of the characteristics of children's literature, and Shizuko was mostly probably very aware of that fact. Also, if we take a look at this slide, you can see how Shizuko is also using some experimentalism with her language. In Japanese, even though probably most of you can't read it, Shizuko is using several alphabets, let's say, to express the sentences here in Japanese. She uses, for instance, also several ends of sentence markers to denote class, sex, or the level of formality according to the speaker's use of each character. She also uses pronouns or conjugation of verbs according to what kind of register would be more appropriate for certain reader or certain speakers. For instance, in this text, the countess, the lady, talks in a highly standard, rather polite register. She uses this formal keiko register with some touches of colloquialism too. However, Walter Tokuzo also uses a more informal countryside Japanese by using sentences such as the command form of damatte nero, shut up and sleep. And he also speaks in a northern dialect, as can be seen with the end of the sentence, daiyo. And the little boy also uses several childish expressions, rather, for instance, damono rather than no damono, which would be the formal way of saying it. And we could say that the little boy, when he talks, he gives an overall image of a young speaker attempting to sound formal, but quite mild. The interesting point here is how Shizuko is using this genbun in this not yet very well used write as you speak literary style in order to convey the English into spoken Japanese, into a literary style that can be simply understood by her female readers and maybe the younger readers as well. Shizuko also plays with the Japanese syllables hiragana and katakana with Chinese ideograms, and she also uses lots of onomatopoeia, which are characteristic in Japanese language because they are very used when addressing children. So we could say that by using several filler words, onomatopoeia, connectives, and sentence and markers, Shizuko is increasing the oral traits of the narration. This gives the text an overall strong sense of fluidity and liveliness that helps this text to be better understood for possible younger readers. In relation to this, Shavit, the scholar who was mentioned before in the other presentation, also explains that the adaptations of children's literature classics tend to be simplified in translation due to the belief that children and young readers will not be able to read texts. In Shizuko's translation or adaptation, however, her text is mostly manipulated by addition rather than omission overall. And she enriches the vocabulary of the readers by adding connectors, not in the original, and new cultural references that are not in the source text. More and final aspect that denotes defamiliarization in this text is the inclusion of cultural reference that do not appear in source text. This is not unusual when adapting words for women, but Shizuko creates both source text and target cultural reference in her translation. Before I mentioned how she included the reference to the pirate, samurai pirate Tametomo, she also includes source cultural references in the translation, such as this mention to Robinson Crusoe, which does not appear on the original text. Creating or adding cultural references is a technique that implies a big degree of integration by the translation, and Shizuko does not hesitate to use it. She experiments with the inclusion of cultural references and with the register of the Genbun Ichi, And it devises the text into the monogatari style, which was also used, by the way, in old folk tales. So for Japanese readers at the time, this monogatari narrative style would have made them remember or think of Japanese old, like tales or folk tales or like stories that they heard when they were children. Shizuko then adapts the source text and enhances it to appeal to her Japanese readers by making it more relatable and easily understood. This is why it could be considered a reconstructed work that stands on its own merits. Also, the use of Genbun Ichi style is rather new for her time, and I will talk about that later at the conclusions, but it must be, again, stressed how new it was for her, for a translator in the last decade of 19th century, to use Genbun Ichi complete and fully in one translated text, because, again, I must mention that women writers were encouraged to write in more classical styles, and this rather colloquial Genbun Ichi style was not apt for them. So to conclusions, this study, briefly compile, or the study talked about how we could see that in Monogatari, in Wasuri Academy, Shizuko used some domesticating, we could say there were some domesticating traits in the translation, but some others related to experimentalism in language. At first glance, like I mentioned before at the beginning, this text looked like it would maybe lean towards domestication. However, upon further analysis, it was revealed that Shizuko also used experimentalism with register, with syllables, hiragana, katakana, kanji, the inclusion of onomatopoeia, and the incorporation of original cultural items, and the narration and the inclusion of dialogues. All of these things will be also understood as defamiliarizing and thus domesticating. And then the resulting text maybe does not rely all on literalism, and it also employs registers and styles already available in the translating language to create a discursive heterogeneity, which is what Venuti refers to as a defamiliarizing translation. Also, the choosing of the Genbun Ichi colloquial style is also noteworthy, because at that time it was a style that was still in flux. It was then a non-standard literary style. It was heterogeneous, and it could be also situated in the periphery of the literary system. So by using that, we could say that Shizuko's style was very broad. She had a very broad stylistic repertoire, and she started using Genbun Ichi in this translation, but she would continue to use her in her more well-known translations. But what's interesting about her translations is that they do not fall into translationes. They are very natural for Japanese readers, very legible, very pleasurable. And even though sometimes they would seem at first glance as domesticating, this presentation, I hope it showed that at first glance, one text might be considered one thing, but maybe it's just the other, or maybe all of them all together. Like some other presenters mentioned before, we must maybe start questioning these binaries in translation studies, and rather to call a text, this is a foreign text, or this is a domesticating text. We should maybe go beyond that in order to not oversimplify this dichotomy. And this is probably my last message. Let us try to not fall into this oversimplified dichotomy of domestication and foreignization, and try to look for more clues within a text in order to identify more complex identities in the translation style that can be found in the target text. Thank you for your time. These are references.
Thank you very much, Paula. You really summarized what we were talking about in the last three speeches now. It is really very interesting to position the translator as the person who really takes has to care about the target culture and the public, of course, and that's cause theory might also be very helpful there. But and his creativity, his individual decision taking, and it is really, really very interesting example of how it is important to take into account the period that the translator was working in, and the society, but also this individual and creative part, because it is a rewrite after all. Are there any questions from the audience? Yeah, Motoko Akashi would like to ask a question. Please do.
Hi, Paula.
Motoko.
Hi. Thank you very much for a very interesting presentation. I have a question. You hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I'm interested in her paratext. In the conclusion, you said text in Japanese, it kind of denotes that it was her creation based on the source text, but also he used the word translation, and although he denies that it is not the novel or original, but she kind of shows her authority. I don't know what you think of that.
So what she says in Japanese is like Miss Proctor no, in English, she uses the word 物語に、書いてみました or 漢字削ってみました
like
so,
just wrote it as like a novel, but she didn't really say this is translated, and then like it seems like she has authority and she kind of I created this.
Right, so she uses the name of the author, Miss Proctor, and she says that this is the memento. Like, I thought that since she's quoting, the author and the original text, like most of the readers, I think they would make the connection that this is an original, I am doing the translation. But as you mentioned, like, it is true that she doesn't use the word translation at all. So maybe that's some gray area that could be further explored, actually.
Yeah, also I think around the Meiji period, lots of translation that published as not meaning that the translation, like he said, it's adaptation, so it's not explicitly remind the reader that it's from somewhere else, like from source text. So I think it's possible that the lots of readers just read it as the original, and had comments like that also gives the impression that this is physical creation based on
and maybe that's why she says that this should not be considered a novel. So should it be considered a translation, adaptation? What do you mean by that? It's very fascinating. Thank you for your input.